what's going on, everybody? It's ETAPRIME back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at a really interesting mini PC from a company known as MELE. We have had a couple of their PCs on the channel before, but this is their all-new offering, known as the MELE Overclock3C. Now, when it comes to overclock, I don't think we've got, a higher boost on this CPU, but the wattage is much higher, and we've got active cooling here, so we can run it at those wattages for much longer than the older PCs they released. All of those were passively cooled. As you can see, they have kept a very small form factor here. It is a bit longer than the older 3C, but again, they're making room here for that active cooling. Got that built-in fan, super thin design, and we've got quite a bit of I/O here, given how small this thing really is. Now, inside of the box with the Overclock3C, you're going to get your 12-volt, 3-amp power supply. It is USB-C, a VESA mount, and obviously the PC itself. They also included an extra thermal pad for an M.2 NVMe SSD because it will support one, but we've also got eMMC storage here. Taking a look at the overall layout and I/O on this device, not much going on around front, but we do have that power button. Moving around to the right-hand side, we've got a total of 3 full-size USB 3 ports here. 2 of these are USB 3.2 10 gigs a second, and one of them is USB 3.2 5 gigs a second. And of course, around back, a lot of stuff is happening here also. We've got a gigabit Ethernet port, USB Type-C for power only, so this does PD 3.0, 2 full-size HDMI 2.0 ports. We've also got a micro SD card slot. It's SD 3.0 up to 100 megabytes a second, a 3.5mm audio jack, and a full-function USB Type-C port back here. We can actually power the unit and get video over that, so this will work in single cable operation mode. Taking a look at the internals, getting the bottom off here is really easy, just 4 screws, and the bottom is constructed of metal. And once we get in here, you'll notice that we do have a swappable NVMe drive and single channel RAM. Now, I really hate when they do this with these lower end chips because dual channel does help out with that iGPU, but that's the way this is set up. This one came with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 running at 2,933 megahertz. And along with that M.2 SSD, this also has onboard eMMC storage. This one came with 256 gigabytes onboard and a 256 gigabyte M.2 SSD. So in total, we've got 512 gigabytes of storage with this mini PC. And when it comes to the overall specs, for the CPU, they opted to use the Intel Celeron N5095. Now this usually runs at 15 watts, but since they're calling it overclock, they've set it right out of the box at 18, so we can get those longer boost times and higher clocks on the iGPU. It's got 4 cores up to 2.9 gigahertz, a built-in Intel UHD iGPU with 16 execution units, and this will run it up to 750 megahertz. We can do up to 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM here. Remember, it's only running in single channel. 1 M.2 SSD plus 256 gigabytes of eMMC storage. Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.2, and it's running Windows 11 right out of the box. So before we get into testing, I did want to give you a look at this single cable operation mode setup. Basically, we've just got one USB Type-C plugged into the back of the mini PC. So we're just basically sending power to the mini PC through the monitor, and in turn, it's sending video signal back. So it's not going to be a super powerful machine. We've only got that Intel Celeron 5095, but they have boosted it up from 15 to 18 watts, which really doesn't sound like much. And in real world performance, it's really not going to net us that much more than a stock N5095. But the overall design here, to keep it nice and cool, keep those boost clocks up, we should see some decent performance given how small this is and what kind of chip it's running. Overall, web browsing's been pretty snappy with Wi-Fi 6 built in, but remember, you can always opt to plug in Ethernet. Really love to see these mini PCs with Ethernet. A lot of companies nowadays kind of leave that out. And this is a very low power consumption PC. This thing isn't going to pull over 25 watts. In fact, I think we could kind of go up to around 23 in total, and that's everything in the PC working at full boat. I've just connected to my game capture so we can get a better look at this thing in action. And the first thing I wanted to test out here was some 4K video playback from YouTube. Now this little chip here actually does a pretty decent job with 4K. Let's make sure we're there. And if you take a look up in the top, our monitor is set to 1080p, but this is set to 4K 60. We've got 4 drop frames so far. I've actually had really good luck with the 5095 and 4K playback. And with the latest Intel UHD graphics drivers, I've actually noticed a little bump in performance here. So yeah, I mean 4K is totally possible on this little machine. Looks good here. 7 drop frames, probably get up to 8 by the end of this video. Not too bad. 4K video playback works great. Obviously 720, 1080 is also going to do a good job. Now, I do want to test out some PC gaming on this. It's not meant to be a gaming PC whatsoever, but there are older games and lower end titles that this thing should run pretty decently. And the first one we have here is Mincraft. You knew I had to test it. Now, when I initially booted this game up, the draw distance was set at 40 chunks. It was a little too much for the CPU, so I took it down to 20. I mean, we've still got a pretty long draw distance. Once I get up, you'll see. It's not cutting anything off, and we are running at 60. Every once in a while, there's a little bit of a hiccup here and there. I really haven't seen it drop under 57. Next up, we've got CupHead, another easier to run title. Now, there's really no graphic settings that we can mess around with, so this is just straight up out of the box, running at 60, and I figured it would. You know, with indie titles, we should have a pretty decent time. You want to do some Shredder's Revenge, some Dead Cells. Little games like that are going to run at full speed, and when it comes to 3D games, we can actually get some pretty good older games out of the way at full speed also. Next up, we've got Left 4 Dead 900p low settings, and these older Source games are going to run really well. If you take a look at Afterburner, we're not pulling over 15 watts with this whole unit here, at least the TDP on that CPU, and that's the CPU and GPU power combined there. So yeah, I mean, it's actually doing much better than I thought it would. I figured we'd be maxed out there at 18 watts or up to around 23 is what we can pull with this thing in total. And the final PC game I wanted to test here before we move on to a little bit of emulation is OG Skyrim. With this one, I tried 900p low settings. Unfortunately, I did have to drop it down to 720 low, but we're getting a constant 60. And you can see CPU power has jumped up to around 20 watts there. That's CPU and GPU combined. So we're not even hitting 23 watts yet with this unit. I also wanted to see how this thing handled emulation, and first up, we've got Dreamcast. I'm using the Redream emulator. I'm upscaled to 1280 by 960. We've got DOA 2, which is a harder one to emulate. Running great here. We didn't dip under 60 at all, and we're only pulling around 8 to 9 watts. Also wanted to take a look at some PSP, so we're using the standalone version of PPSSPP, DirectX 11 backend. Also tested Vulkan, seems to perform around the same. 2x resolution with Chains of Olympus, which means, you know, with the easier to run games, we can go up to 4x. But yeah, I mean, this is one of those that we could definitely play our favorite PSP games on without an issue. And finally, we've got some GameCube emulation using the Dolphin emulator. And with Soul Calibur 2 here, it's definitely an easier one to run. We'll take a look at something a bit harder in a second. I did run into some crashing issues when I was in full screen. Not sure if it's a driver issue or whatnot, so I did leave it window mode through the GameCube testing just to make sure it didn't crash on me anymore. Full speed here at 1x DirectX 11 backend, and we're under 12 watts. But again, this is an easier one to emulate, so let's take it up to Auto Modellista. This is kind of my go-to test. Again, 1x resolution, DirectX 11 backend, and you'll see this jump up to around 18 watts every once in a while, but on average, we're right there at around 12 watts. Not too bad. This is a harder one to emulate on these lower end systems, and especially around this corner here. Lots of the lower end chips do dip down. Even the N5095 at 15 watts dips here, but since we've got a little boost on that TDP, it can definitely keep those clocks up high enough. Another thing I like to monitor with these mini PCs is total system power consumption, and I did mention that this is a low power consumption PC. Throughout my testing, I have this plugged into a kilowatt meter, and at idle, we average 4 watts. Average gaming across the board, 16 watts, and the maximum that I could get this to pull from the wall while maxing out the CPU and GPU was only 21 watts. Overall, not a bad little system for the chip we have here, but there are newer chips. This is a Jasper Lake Celeron N5095. I really wish they would have went with the new N100 or something like that, or even that new i3, because we could see a lot better performance out of it. But if you're looking for a super small form factor PC for web browsing, 4K video playback, some light gaming, and emulation. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. If you got any questions or you want to see anything else running on the MELE Overclock3C, just let me know down below. And like always, thanks for watching.